Elena Thompson's life is one of routine and quiet solitude, until the day her world is shattered. Accused of shoplifting in her local mall, this kind-hearted 71-year-old woman finds herself humiliated and manhandled by two security guards who refuse to believe her innocence. But when her son, Ethan Thompson, a retired Army officer turned private investigator, arrives, everything changes. Determined to protect his mother, Ethan demands answers, only to uncover a tangled web of manipulation involving a woman from his past and a dangerous criminal with ties to his own family's secrets. As Ethan races against time to clear his mother's name, he must navigate hidden agendas and dark truths that threaten everything he holds dear. With every revelation, he's forced to confront the mysterious disappearance of his father, a man whose secrets might just be the key to solving the case. Loyalty, betrayal, and family collide in this gripping thriller where justice hangs in the balance and the past refuses to stay buried. Will Ethan uncover the truth and protect those he loves, or will he lose everything he has fought for? Elena Thompson moved through the grocery store's aisles with the same rhythm she'd perfected over the years. Her cane tapped softly against the polished floor, marking her slow but steady progress. She reached for a jar of strawberry jam, her favorite, and one she had indulged in since she was a child. The familiarity of the routine brought a smile to her face. In her world, where the pace had slowed and the days often blurred together, these small comforts were precious. As she approached the checkout line, she felt a slight ache in her knee. She paused, leaning on her cane, and adjusted her weight. She glanced around, taking in the familiar sights, the cheerful hum of conversation, the beeping of cash registers, and the gentle chatter of the store's radio playing a nostalgic tune from the 60s. It was an ordinary day, and that was exactly how she liked it. After paying for her groceries, she carefully placed her receipt in her purse, right next to the photograph of her late husband, Thomas. With a deep breath, she began her slow walk toward the exit. Elena was almost at the exit when she heard the sudden, stern voice. "Ma'am, stop right there." She turned, her heart skipping a beat. Two security guards approached, their faces hard and unyielding. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We've received a report that you've been shoplifting," one of the guards said, his expression unwavering. Elena's eyes widened in shock. "That's impossible. I paid for everything." She reached into her purse, her fingers shaking as she fumbled for the receipt. She pulled it out, holding it up as if it were a shield. "Here, see? I paid for everything." The guard glanced at the receipt, but didn't seem convinced. "I'm going to need you to come with us, ma'am." "Please, this must be a mistake," Elena pleaded, but the guards were already closing in. One of them gripped her arm tightly, and she winced. Her cane clattered to the floor as they dragged her toward the back of the store. Ethan Thompson's phone buzzed on the dashboard as he pulled into the mall parking lot. He saw his mother's name flash on the screen and picked up immediately. "Hey, Mom, I'm almost there. Do you need anything?" There was no response at first, only the sound of shuffling and faint, panicked voices. Then, Elena's voice, fragile and desperate. "Ethan, something's wrong. They think I stole something." Ethan's body tensed. "Mom, where are you?" he asked, his voice sharp and focused. "They're taking me to the back of the store," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm coming. Stay calm, okay?" Ethan hung up, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. His instincts, honed from years in the Army and as a private investigator, kicked in. He parked quickly and jogged toward the entrance, weaving through the afternoon crowd with purpose. Ethan spotted his mother being led toward the employee area by the two guards. Her face, pale and streaked with tears, sent a surge of anger through him. "Hey!" he shouted, pushing his way forward. "What's going on here?" The guards turned, their expressions wary but firm. "Sir, this is none of your business," one of them said. "She's my mother," Ethan replied, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm making it my business. Let her go." The guards didn't budge. Ethan pulled out his investigator's badge, flashing it with practiced ease. "Look at her receipt. She didn't steal anything." The guard holding the receipt hesitated, glancing between the paper and Ethan's badge. We were just following protocol, he mumbled, his grip on Elena loosening slightly. Ethan stepped forward, taking the receipt from the guard's hand and examining it. Everything was in order, just as he knew it would be. This is a mistake, he said, his voice cold. Now let her go. Before the guards could respond, a voice emerged from the small crowd that had gathered. It's my fault. Ethan turned to see a young woman stepping forward. She had light brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes, green and filled with guilt, were fixed on Elena. I told them she was stealing, the woman admitted, her voice breaking. What? Elena whispered, her confusion deepening. The woman looked at Ethan, recognizing him. I'm sorry. I had no choice. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he remembered her face. Laura. They had crossed paths before during a case. Why would you do this? He asked, his tone measured. Laura's eyes darted around nervously. It's my ex. He works here. He made me do it. He said if I didn't distract security, her voice trailed off, and she looked down, ashamed. Ethan's jaw tightened. Where is he now? Laura shook her head. I don't know. He's planning something big. He's using the distraction to rob the store's safe. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. His mother's distress was part of a larger scheme, and Laura was just as much a victim. He needed to act fast. Mom, he said gently, turning to Elena, it's going to be okay. I need you to go sit down and stay calm, all right? Elena nodded, though the fear remained in her eyes. Be careful, Ethan. Ethan gave her a reassuring smile before turning back to Laura. Show me where the safe is, he ordered. The two of them moved quickly through the store, Laura leading the way. They arrived at a narrow corridor, the entrance to the back offices. Ethan's senses were on high alert, scanning for any sign of Laura's ex. As they approached the office door, they heard voices, low and urgent. Ethan pulled Laura back. Stay here, he whispered. He pushed open the door slightly, peeking inside. His eyes locked onto a man standing in front of an open safe, stuffing cash into a bag. It was Jake Harris, the man Laura had described. Tall, lean, and with a hardened look that matched his reputation, Jake didn't notice Ethan watching. Ethan took a deep breath, his military training guiding him. He stepped into the room, his voice steady. Jake. Jake spun around, his eyes narrowing when he saw Ethan. You. Ethan's eyes flicked to the gun tucked into Jake's waistband. This ends now. Drop the bag. Jake smirked, his hand inching toward the weapon. You think you can just walk in here and stop me? Ethan stayed calm, his stance ready. I know what you're doing, and I know you're using Laura to cover your tracks. Let her go. Jake's smirk faltered for a moment, but his hand still hovered near the gun. She's mine to deal with, not yours. Before Jake could react further, Ethan lunged, disarming him with a swift, practiced move. The bag fell to the floor as the two men grappled. Laura, peering in from the doorway, watched in horror. After a tense struggle, Ethan managed to pin Jake down, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. It's over, he said, securing Jake's hands behind his back. With Jake restrained, Ethan called the authorities. As the sirens approached, he turned to Laura, who stood in the hallway, tears in her eyes. I'm sorry for everything, she said, her voice trembling. Ethan sighed. It's not your fault, but you need to get out of this mess. We'll make sure you're safe. She nodded, grateful, but the fear in her eyes remained. Thank you, Ethan. As the police arrived, Ethan walked over to his mother, who was sitting on a bench outside the store, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped her cane. It's over, Mom. You're safe. Elena looked up at him, relief flooding her eyes. I knew you'd come. Ethan smiled, hugging her gently. Always. Ethan stood with his hands on his hips, his eyes cold and piercing as he faced the two guards. Tell me again why you thought an elderly woman was stealing, he demanded, his voice carrying the authority he'd honed over years in the military and as an investigator. The guard shifted uncomfortably. We were just following orders. We got a tip. Ethan's brow furrowed. A tip from whom? The guard hesitated, his eyes flickering to the backroom door before he finally spoke. A woman. She said she saw your mother slip something into her bag. Ethan's gaze hardened as he nodded. And you didn't think to check her receipt before dragging her away? The guard looked down, suddenly interested in his shoes. It's protocol to take them to the back first. Ethan shook his head in disbelief. You didn't even bother verifying. You just assumed. He turned to the other guard, who remained silent, his posture defensive. As Ethan opened his mouth to continue, Laura appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide and anxious. Ethan, I swear, I didn't want to do it. He made me, she said, her voice cracking. Ethan's attention shifted to Laura. I know. Tell me exactly what happened. She took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting. Jake. He told me to report someone. Said it had to be an older woman, someone who wouldn't fight back. I had no choice. Jake Harris? Ethan's voice was sharp. Laura nodded. He's planning something big, Ethan. He needed a distraction. Ethan rubbed his temple, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. And you know where he is now? Laura shook her head. I just know he's still here, somewhere in the mall. He was watching us when I tipped off the guards. Ethan's mind raced as he processed the information. All right, stay with my mother. Don't let her out of your sight. I'm going to check the security footage. Laura's eyes widened. Ethan, be careful. Jake. He's dangerous. Ethan gave her a brief nod. I know, but he made a mistake targeting my mother. With that, he turned and headed toward the mall security office. The security office was dimly lit, with monitors showing live feeds from all over the mall. Ethan approached the desk, flashing his badge at the guard on duty. I need access to the footage from the past hour. The guard looked skeptical at first but then nodded, clicking a few keys. Which area? The grocery store exit and the back hallway, Ethan instructed, leaning over the desk as the footage played. He watched as his mother entered the store, picked up her groceries, and paid at the register. Everything seemed normal, until Laura appeared, speaking hurriedly to the guards. There, Ethan said, pointing. Back it up. The guard complied, rewinding the footage. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he watched Laura's interaction. Her body language was anxious, her eyes darting around. Play it forward slowly. The screen showed Laura gesturing toward Elena. The guards immediately went into action, approaching his mother. Ethan's jaw clenched as he saw them grab Elena's arm, the look of fear on her face making his blood boil. Freeze it there, Ethan ordered. He studied the background of the footage and spotted a shadowed figure watching from a distance. Jake. Zoom in on that man. The guard did as told, but the image remained grainy. Best we can do, sir. Ethan frowned, recognizing the silhouette even with the poor resolution. Jake Harris, as he suspected. Where does this hallway lead? Staff offices and the storage area, the guard replied. Ethan straightened up. I need to check it out. The guard hesitated. I can't let you back there without proper clearance. Ethan's patience was running thin. Listen, that man, he pointed at the screen, is involved in a robbery. Either you let me through, or I call in backup, and this whole place becomes a crime scene. The guard's eyes widened. All right, I'll unlock it for you. Ethan made his way through the narrow, dimly lit hallway, his senses heightened. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of the mall's ventilation system. He reached the door to the storage room, pushing it open cautiously. The room was cluttered with boxes, and the smell of cardboard and dust filled the air. He moved silently, scanning the area for any signs of Jake. As he turned a corner, a voice broke the silence. Looking for someone? Ethan's hand shot to his holster as he faced Jake, who emerged from behind a stack of boxes, a smug grin plastered on his face. Ethan Thompson, always the hero. Jake, Ethan replied, keeping his tone measured. What's your game here? Jake shrugged, crossing his arms. A job, that's all. But you? Why do you always have to stick your nose where it doesn't belong? When it involves my mother, it's my business, Ethan retorted. You used Laura. Why? Jake's grin faded, replaced by a sneer. Laura owes me. She knows the price of crossing me. Ethan's fists clenched. Let her go. Whatever hold you have on her, it ends now. Jake's eyes darkened. You think you can just walk in and save everyone? You don't know how deep this goes. Ethan took a step forward. Try me. For a moment, the two men stared each other down. Then, without warning, Jake shoved a nearby shelf, sending boxes tumbling toward Ethan. Ethan dodged, his movements swift, but in the chaos, Jake bolted for the door. Ethan gave chase, sprinting down the hallway. As they neared the exit, Jake turned, pulling out a knife. Back off, Ethan. Ethan stopped, raising his hands slightly. Put it down, Jake. You don't want to make this worse. Jake's eyes darted around, filled with desperation. You don't get it. I'm already in too deep. Before Ethan could respond, a figure emerged from a side corridor. An older man with a hardened expression. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It was a face he hadn't seen in years, one of his father's old associates. Ethan, the man said, his voice low. Walk away. Ethan's eyes flicked between the two men. What's going on here? The associate shook his head. You don't want to know. For your mother's sake, walk away. Jake's knife hand trembled. Listen to him, Ethan. You don't know what you're dealing with. Ethan's mind raced. You think I'll back down? My father was caught up in something, and now my mother's involved. I'm not letting this go. The associate sighed, his face a mask of regret. You're just like him, too stubborn for your own good. Before Ethan could react, the associate stepped back, pulling Jake with him. Consider this a warning. Next time, it won't end with just words. The door slammed shut, leaving Ethan alone in the hallway, the echoes of their departure still ringing in his ears. Ethan returned to the main mall area, his mind racing. He needed answers, and the encounter had raised more questions than it answered. Laura was waiting with Elena, her eyes filled with anxiety. Did you find him? She asked, her voice tense. Ethan nodded slowly. I found him, but there's more going on than I thought. He turned to Elena, his expression softening. Let's get you home, Mom. Elena's eyes were still full of worry, but she nodded. What are you going to do? Ethan helped her to her feet, his voice firm. I'm going to get to the bottom of this. As they walked toward the exit, Laura pulled Ethan aside. Ethan, Jake's not working alone. He's scared of someone. I know, Ethan replied, his eyes locked ahead. And I'm going to find out who. He watched as Laura's expression shifted, hope and fear mingling together. Be careful, Ethan. They're dangerous. Ethan gave her a reassuring nod. I've faced danger before. This time, it's personal. As he guided his mother to the car, the weight of the past and the mystery of his father's involvement loomed over him. It was clear that the road ahead would be treacherous, but Ethan was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Ethan sat across from his mother in her cozy apartment. The familiar scent of freshly brewed tea filled the room, mingling with the aroma of the baked goods she'd prepared. He tried to focus on the comfort of the moment, but his mind was racing. Elena's warm, brown eyes watched him with concern. Ethan, you're so quiet, she said, reaching over to place a hand on his. What's wrong? He sighed, leaning back in his chair. Mom, I need to ask you about Dad. Elena's hand froze. Her expression shifted, the warmth in her eyes replaced by a flicker of pain. Why now? She asked, her voice soft. I found something, someone from his past. Someone who's connected to what happened at the mall. Ethan watched her reaction closely. This isn't just about that day. It goes back years. Elena pulled her hand back, clutching her cane tightly. Ethan, your father. He wasn't perfect, but he loved us. Whatever you think you've found, it's not what it seems. Ethan's jaw tightened. I need to know the truth, Mom. It's the only way I can protect you. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded slowly. Your father used to know some people at the mall. He did business with them when you were young. I never knew the details. He always kept that part of his life separate from us. But after he died, I found papers. What kind of papers? Elena hesitated, her gaze drifting to a drawer across the room. There were receipts, addresses, places he went to regularly. I didn't understand any of it, so I put it all away. Ethan followed her gaze. Can I see them? With a nod, Elena slowly rose, using her cane for support. She opened the drawer and pulled out an old, worn envelope. These are all I kept, she said, handing it to him. Ethan opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the contents. There were business cards for several shops in the mall, receipts for large sums of money, and a photograph of his father shaking hands with a man Ethan recognized, his father's associate from the mall. "This is exactly what I needed, Mom," he said, squeezing her hand. "It helps me connect the dots." Elena looked worried. "Be careful, Ethan. Whatever this is, it was enough to take your father from us." Ethan nodded. "I will be. I promise." Back in his office, Ethan spread the documents out on his desk. He stared at the photo, his father's familiar smile now seeming like a mask hiding secrets. As he made notes, there was a knock at the door. He glanced up to see Laura, her eyes filled with urgency. "Come in," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Laura sat down, wringing her hands. "Ethan, I don't have much time. Jake's getting suspicious." "What did you find out?" Ethan asked, his tone serious. Laura bit her lip. "He's planning something bigger. He's been using the mall as a front for months, but now he's moving money, big money. And he's getting desperate." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Do you know where he's keeping it?" She nodded. "There's an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. I've seen him go there a few times with other men." Ethan leaned forward. "And you're sure it's connected to the mall?" "Yes. It's all tied together. Jake's been using the store's shipments to move things in and out of the warehouse. I think your father knew about it." Ethan's heart raced. "How do you know that?" Laura hesitated, glancing down. "Jake has some papers with your father's name on them. I saw them once when he wasn't paying attention. He keeps them in his office at the warehouse." Ethan processed this information, his mind connecting the pieces. "Laura, I need your help. We need to get inside that warehouse." Her eyes widened. "Ethan, if he catches us—" "I know the risks," he replied. "But if we don't do this, he's going to keep using people, like you, like my mom. We have a chance to stop him." Laura looked torn, fear evident in her eyes. But finally, she nodded. "Okay, I'll help you." Later that night, Ethan and Laura crouched behind an old car parked outside the warehouse. The building was run down, its walls covered in graffiti and its windows shattered. It stood in stark contrast to the bright, welcoming mall where this all began. Ethan pulled out a pair of binoculars, scanning the area. "Looks clear, but stay close." They moved silently through the shadows, approaching a side entrance. Laura pulled out a set of keys. "I stole these from Jake's office," she whispered, her hands shaking. Ethan gave her a reassuring nod. "Good thinking." She unlocked the door, and they slipped inside. The air was thick with the scent of dust and oil, and the only light came from flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling. They moved down a narrow corridor lined with old crates and stacks of paper. Ethan's senses were on high alert. "Stay behind me," he whispered. They reached a small office at the end of the hall. Laura gestured to the desk. "This is where he keeps the documents." Ethan began rifling through the papers, his eyes scanning for anything that could connect his father to the operation. Suddenly, he froze. "Laura, look at this." She leaned over his shoulder, her eyes widening as she saw the names and figures on the documents. "Your father's name, and all these payments." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't just involved. He was funding it. Just as he grabbed the documents, they heard a noise outside. Ethan's hand shot out, motioning for Laura to stay quiet. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. "Hide," he whispered urgently. They ducked behind a large cabinet as the door creaked open. Jake's voice filled the room. "I know you're in here, Laura." Laura's breathing quickened, and Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder to steady her. "Stay calm," he mouthed. Jake stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the shadows. "You think you can betray me and get away with it?" Ethan's grip tightened on the papers. This was their chance to slip out, but they had to wait for the right moment. Jake moved closer, his hand resting on his belt, where a knife gleamed under the dim light. Laura's eyes met Ethan's, filled with fear, but he gave her a nod, his signal. As Jake turned his back for a brief second, they bolted from their hiding spot, sprinting down the hall. "Stop them!" Jake yelled, but they were already out the door. They ran through the night, not stopping until they reached Ethan's car parked a block away. Both of them were breathless as they collapsed inside. Laura clutched the steering wheel, her knuckles white. "Ethan, what do we do now?" Ethan pulled out the documents, flipping through them. "We have proof now, but there's one more thing we need." "What's that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan's eyes were cold, determined. "We need to find out exactly what my father's role was in all of this, and why Jake was working with him." Laura nodded, her expression resolute. "I'm with you, Ethan. Whatever it takes." Ethan started the car, his mind set on the next step. "Then we follow this lead. We find out everything." As they drove off into the night, Ethan knew the deeper he dug, the more dangerous it would become. But there was no turning back. The truth was out there, and he would stop at nothing to uncover it. Ethan paced back and forth in his office, the walls around him cluttered with maps, notes, and photographs. The more he unraveled about his father's past, the more tangled everything became. As he stared at the evidence pinned to the board, he felt a heaviness settling in his chest. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Laura. "Ethan, we need to talk." Her voice was shaky, almost a whisper. "Where are you?" he asked, sensing the urgency in her tone. "Outside your building. I couldn't risk anyone seeing me." Ethan hurried down the stairs and opened the door. Laura stood there, glancing over her shoulder, her eyes wide with fear. He gestured for her to come inside, and once they were in the safety of his office, she let out a breath. "What happened?" Ethan asked, crossing his arms. Laura took a moment to compose herself. "I overheard Jake talking to his men. He's planning something big, bigger than anything I thought. And there's a name that keeps coming up. The Family Man." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "The Family Man?" She nodded. "I don't know who it is, but Jake's afraid of him. He said if anything goes wrong, the Family Man will make sure it's taken care of." Ethan's gut twisted. "I've heard that name before. My father used to mention it in passing, but I always thought it was just another one of his stories." Laura's expression softened. "Ethan, I think your father might have been involved in all of this more than you realize." He clenched his fists, a mixture of anger and confusion swirling within him. "If that's true, then he wasn't the man I thought he was." Laura reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "We'll figure it out. But for now, you need to be careful. Jake's planning to make a move soon, and he's watching everyone, especially you." Ethan nodded, determination hardening his features. "I'm not backing down. If my father was part of this, then I need to know the truth." Ethan returned to the Pineview Mall later that day, his eyes scanning the area for the familiar faces of the guards who had detained his mother. He needed more information, but as he approached, he noticed the guards exchanging uneasy glances. When he confronted one of them, the guard's expression shifted from surprise to irritation. "We're not allowed to talk to you," he said, crossing his arms. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Why not?" "Orders from above," the guard replied, his gaze darting around as if searching for someone watching. "Look, man, I don't want trouble. Who's giving the orders?" Ethan pressed. The guard hesitated, then shook his head. "I've said too much already. Just leave before you make things worse." As Ethan turned to leave, he noticed a man in the distance, leaning against a wall and watching him intently. The man's presence felt calculated, like he was monitoring every move Ethan made. Ethan's instinct screamed at him. He was being followed. Later that evening, Ethan sat in his car outside the mall, keeping a close eye on the entrance. He saw the man who had been watching him earlier, now talking to another figure, Jake. Ethan gripped the steering wheel, his suspicions confirmed. He was under surveillance. He waited until Jake disappeared into the crowd before stepping out of his car and following the man. They weaved through the narrow alleys behind the mall, and just as the man turned a corner, Ethan confronted him. "Why are you following me?" Ethan demanded, grabbing the man by the collar and pinning him against the wall. The man smirked, not at all fazed by Ethan's aggression. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Try me." Ethan shot back, his grip tightening. The man's smirk faded, replaced by a cold stare. "This is bigger than you, Thompson. Back off, or your mother pays the price." Ethan's blood ran cold, but he kept his expression controlled. "You tell Jake, and whoever he works for, that I'm not afraid." The man shoved Ethan's hand away, brushing off his collar. "Consider this your only warning. The family man doesn't give second chances." As the man walked away, Ethan felt the weight of the threat hanging over him. They were watching, and they knew how to hurt him. Back in his office, Ethan sat across from Laura, his expression grim. "They know, Laura. They're watching me, and they're using my mother as leverage." Laura's face paled. "Ethan, we need to act fast. We need to get her somewhere safe." He nodded. "But first, I need to know everything you've heard. If my father was involved, I need to understand his role." Laura hesitated, then sighed. "I overheard something else. Jake mentioned that your father had a side operation, something separate from the main business. He called it insurance." "Insurance?" Ethan echoed, his mind racing. "What kind of insurance?" "I don't know," Laura admitted, "but I think it's tied to the mall security. Jake and his men have been bribing people for months, making sure their operations go unnoticed." Ethan rubbed his temple, feeling the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. So my father was running his own scheme within the larger operation. But why? Laura shook her head. "Maybe he was trying to protect you and your mother. Or maybe it was something darker." Ethan's eyes darkened. "There's only one way to find out. I need to confront someone who knew him well." Ethan drove to a small, run-down house on the edge of town. The place was a shadow of its former self, but it belonged to a man who had been his father's closest friend, Jim Donovan, a retired cop. Jim opened the door, his expression wary. "Ethan, it's been a long time." Ethan nodded, stepping inside. "I need answers, Jim. It's about my father." Jim's face hardened. "I told you to stay out of this." "I can't," Ethan insisted. "I need to know what he was involved in." Jim sighed, sinking into an old armchair. "Your father was a good man, but he got tangled up in things he shouldn't have. He thought he could play both sides, keep you and Elena safe while making deals with dangerous people." Ethan's heart pounded. Why didn't he just walk away? "Because once you're in, Jim said, his eyes tired. He tried to protect his family the only way he knew how. He thought if he controlled some of the operations, he could keep the worst of it away from you." Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. "So he was part of it, but he was trying to shield us?" Jim nodded. "But it got complicated. The family man didn't trust him anymore, and your father knew too much." Ethan clenched his fists. "Is that why he died?" Jim's silence was answer enough. Ethan stood, the weight of the truth sinking in. "I'm not going to let them get away with it, Jim. They used my father, and now they're trying to use my mother." Jim's eyes were somber. "Be careful, Ethan. If you dig too deep, you might end up like him." Ethan turned, his resolve only strengthening. "I'd rather go down fighting." As Ethan drove back to his office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Meet me alone at the warehouse tonight, or your mother pays the price." Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. The stakes had been raised. Jake was making his move, and now it was personal. He knew he couldn't afford to ignore the threat. When he arrived at his office, he found Laura pacing nervously. "What's the plan?" she asked, her eyes filled with worry. "I'm going to the warehouse," Ethan said, pulling out his gun and checking the clip. Laura's eyes widened. "Alone? You can't." "I don't have a choice," he interrupted. "They have my mother. This ends tonight." Laura hesitated, then nodded. "I'm coming with you." Ethan looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes. "Are you sure?" She squared her shoulders. "I'm not letting Jake control my life anymore. We end this together." Ethan nodded, the two of them preparing for what lay ahead. As they left the office, Ethan felt a sense of purpose and dread. The deeper betrayal was clear. His father had tried to protect them, but now it was up to him to finish what his father started. This was no longer about justice. It was about survival, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to protect the people he loved. Ethan's mind raced as he and Laura prepared for the confrontation ahead. They had only one shot at this, one chance to bring down Jake and his network while clearing his mother's name. Standing in his office, Ethan pulled up a map of the warehouse, marking the entry points and exits. "This is where he'll be," Ethan said, pointing to a section of the building highlighted in red. If we time it right, we can get in and out before his men even know what happened. Laura studied the map, her face tense but determined. And what about the evidence? If we don't get enough to prove what he's done, this won't end. Jake will just rebuild. Ethan nodded, his expression hard. We'll get it. I know where he keeps the records. His office has a safe. That's where we'll find what we need. Laura hesitated, her eyes searching his. And if it doesn't go according to plan? Ethan's eyes met hers, unwavering. We improvise. But we get what we came for. The drive to the warehouse felt like an eternity. Ethan's thoughts were a whirlwind of planning, strategy, and the lingering shadow of his father's legacy. Was he doing the right thing by exposing the truth, even if it meant dismantling the memory he had of his father as a good man? Laura broke the silence. Ethan, you know this isn't just about Jake anymore. I know, he replied, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. But if my father was involved, it's time to bring it all to light. As they approached the warehouse, Ethan parked the car a block away. They moved quietly through the shadows, the only sound being the faint rustle of wind against the nearby trees. The warehouse loomed ahead, its walls covered in graffiti and its windows dark. Ethan and Laura crept around the side, stopping at a service door. Ready? He whispered. Laura nodded, pulling out the stolen keycard she had swiped from Jake's office days earlier. The lock clicked, and they slipped inside. The warehouse was a maze of corridors and storage areas filled with crates and old machinery. The air was cold and heavy, and every step they took echoed faintly. Ethan led the way, his eyes scanning for any signs of movement. Laura stayed close, her hand gripping the flashlight she had brought, ready to turn it on if needed. They reached Jake's office, a small room at the end of a long hall. Ethan paused, listening for any noise. When he heard nothing, he motioned for Laura to follow. Inside, the room was cluttered with papers and old ledgers. Against the far wall stood the safe. Keep watch, Ethan instructed as he knelt down, pulling out a small toolkit. Laura positioned herself by the door, her eyes darting down the hall. Hurry, she whispered. Ethan's fingers worked quickly, his training as a private investigator coming in handy. Within minutes, the safe door clicked open. Inside, he found stacks of cash, documents, and, most importantly, a set of files labeled with his father's name. Got it, he said, grabbing the files. Let's move. But as they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps filled the hallway. Laura's eyes widened. Ethan, someone's coming. Ethan cursed under his breath, shoving the files into his bag. This way, he whispered, pulling Laura through a side door that led to another corridor. They moved quickly, trying to stay ahead of the approaching footsteps. But as they rounded a corner, they ran straight into one of Jake's men. The man's eyes went wide with surprise, but Ethan reacted first, knocking him out with a swift punch. Go, Ethan urged, and they sprinted through the maze of hallways. The house echoed with the sounds of shouts and the distant thud of boots on concrete. Ethan and Laura ducked behind a stack of crates, catching their breath. We're almost at the exit, Ethan whispered, peering around the corner. Laura's face was pale, her breath coming fast. They're blocking the main door. Ethan scanned the area, formulating a plan. There's a service hatch near the back. We'll use that. But just as they moved, a shot rang out, and Laura cried out in pain, clutching her leg as she fell to the ground. Ethan, she gasped. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, his eyes wide with concern. You're going to be okay. Just stay with me. He scanned the warehouse, spotting Jake and several of his men closing in. Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't leave Laura, but he also couldn't take on Jake's crew alone. They needed a distraction. Laura, I'm going to get you out of here, he said, his voice firm. Laura shook her head. Take the files and go. You have to clear your mother's name. No, Ethan said, his eyes blazing. I'm not leaving you. As the footsteps grew closer, Ethan grabbed a nearby crate and threw it against the wall, creating a loud crash that echoed through the warehouse. Jake's men paused, giving Ethan the moment he needed. He lifted Laura into his arms and sprinted for the service hatch. Outside, the night was quiet and still, a stark contrast to the chaos inside. Ethan carried Laura to the car, laying her gently in the back seat. "Hold on. We're almost out of this." Laura winced, but managed a weak smile. "You really are stubborn, Ethan." Ethan smirked. "Part of the job." He drove quickly, the streets a blur as he raced to his safe house, a small, discreet location he kept for emergencies. Once they were inside, he carefully bandaged Laura's wound. "You're lucky," he said, his tone lighter. "It's not too deep." Laura let out a breath. "Ethan, you saved me." "You didn't have to." He looked at her, his expression serious. "I did have to. We're in this together, remember?" As Laura rested, Ethan spread out the documents he had taken from the safe. His eyes scanned the pages, and the truth slowly came into focus. His father's name appeared again and again, connected to various transactions, but one document stood out, a letter. It was dated 2 months before his father's death and addressed to the family man. Ethan's hands shook as he read the words. "If anything happens to me, make sure they know the truth. I tried to protect my family, but they're on to me. The files are the key. JT." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. His father had known he was in danger and had tried to leave a trail, one that Ethan had finally uncovered. But there was more. A location was mentioned, one Ethan had not heard before. The dockyard. Laura, now sitting up, looked at him. "What is it?" Ethan held up the letter. "The dockyard. It's where everything ties together. My father left a trail, and that's where we'll find the last piece of evidence." Laura nodded, determination in her eyes. "Then we finish this." The next night, Ethan and Laura prepared for their final move. They knew the dockyard would be heavily guarded, but they were ready. Armed with the files and the knowledge his father had left behind, Ethan felt a sense of clarity. As they approached the dockyard, they parked the car at a distance and made their way through the shadows. The cold night air was thick with anticipation. "Stick close," Ethan whispered. "We're almost there." They moved silently, the sounds of the distant ocean masking their footsteps. Ahead, they saw the warehouse, the final destination. Ethan took a deep breath. "This is it, Laura. We end it tonight." Laura's hand tightened around his. "Let's make sure we walk out of this." Together, they pushed forward, ready to face the truth and the danger that awaited them. The ties that bound them to the past and to each other would be tested, and Ethan knew that by the end of the night, everything would change. Ethan and Laura moved swiftly through the dockyard, the cold night air biting at their faces. The massive warehouse loomed ahead, its lights casting long shadows across the ground. Ethan's heart pounded as they neared the entrance. This was it, the final showdown. "Stay close," he whispered, checking his weapon. Laura nodded, her face a mask of determination. They slipped through a side entrance, the creak of the metal door echoing in the quiet. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of crates and machinery, much like the one they had infiltrated before. But this time, there was an electric tension in the air. Ethan led the way, navigating through the stacks and keeping his eyes peeled for any movement. "Ethan, over there," Laura whispered, pointing to a small office perched on a raised platform in the center of the room. The light inside was on, and the silhouette of a figure could be seen moving about. "That's Jake," Ethan confirmed, his voice low. "He's alone." Laura's grip tightened on her flashlight. "We confront him now?" Ethan nodded. "We need to know everything." They crept up the stairs leading to the office, pausing just outside the door. Ethan took a deep breath, signaling Laura to stay back. Then, in one swift motion, he kicked open the door, his gun raised. Jake, startled, spun around, but the smirk on his face remained. "Well, if it isn't the hero and his sidekick." "Cut the act, Jake," Ethan said, his voice cold. "We know everything. We have the documents." Jake's expression flickered, but he quickly regained his composure. "You think you've won just because you have some papers?" "It's over," Laura added, stepping forward. "The police will be here any minute." Jake's eyes darted between them, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flash of fear. "You have no idea what you're getting into. The family man. He's bigger than you think." Ethan's grip on his gun tightened. "Who is he, Jake? Why did my father work for him?" Jake laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in the small room. Your father? You still don't get it, do you? He reached into his pocket, but Ethan aimed his gun, stopping him. Relax, Thompson. I'm just grabbing a letter. Jake pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and tossed it onto the desk. Read it. Ethan kept his eyes on Jake as he picked up the paper. It was another letter, addressed to his father. I know you want out, but it's too late. You've tied yourself to the family man, and there's no escape. Protect your son. Don't let him find out the truth. Ethan's hands trembled as he read the words. My father wanted out? Jake nodded. He did. But when he tried to walk away, they made sure he wouldn't talk. Faked his death to keep him quiet. Laura's eyes widened. You mean he's alive? Jake shrugged. He was. Last I heard, he disappeared for good. Either he found a way to escape, or they silenced him. Ethan's mind raced, the revelation hitting him like a punch. Where is he? I don't know, Jake said, his tone almost sincere. But you're not going to find him if you keep playing the hero. Before Ethan could respond, the door behind them slammed open. Two men stepped in, guns drawn. Drop your weapon, Thompson, one of them ordered. Ethan and Laura exchanged a glance. They were outnumbered. Slowly, Ethan placed his gun on the ground. This isn't over, Jake. Jake smirked, but before he could say anything, another voice filled the room. No, it's not. Everyone turned as a figure stepped out of the shadows. Ethan's father. Ethan's heart stopped as he locked eyes with the man he thought had died years ago. Dad. John Thompson, older and wearier, but unmistakably alive, nodded. Hello, Ethan. Ethan's emotions swirled. Anger, relief, confusion. You've been alive this whole time? John's eyes were somber. I had to disappear. I was protecting you and your mother. Ethan's fists clenched. By abandoning us? By working with these criminals? John's face hardened. I didn't have a choice. The family man. He has eyes everywhere. If I hadn't played along, you and your mother would have been targets. Jake, watching the exchange, smirked. Touching reunion. But we're on a clock here. John's gaze shifted to Jake, his expression darkening. I'm done taking orders. It's time this ends. In a blur of motion, John grabbed the gun from one of Jake's men, disarming him. Chaos erupted as Ethan and Laura dove for cover. Shots rang out, and the room filled with the echo of gunfire. Ethan grabbed his weapon, firing back at Jake's men as he and Laura took cover behind a desk. Get down! Ethan shouted, pulling Laura to safety. His eyes locked onto his father, who was exchanging fire with Jake. The fight was intense, the air thick with tension and smoke. Ethan and John moved in sync, instinct and training guiding them. For a brief moment, it felt like old times, father and son, working together. But the stakes were higher now. As Jake's men fell, the room grew quiet. Jake, realizing he was outmatched, turned to run, but John blocked his path. It's over, Jake, John said, his voice firm. Jake's eyes flicked between Ethan and John. You really think you can walk away from this, old man? John's gaze was unyielding. I'm not walking away. I'm finishing it. Jake lunged, pulling out a knife. But before he could strike, John fired, the shot echoing in the stillness of the room. Jake crumpled to the floor, clutching his chest. Ethan rushed over, his breath heavy. Dad. John lowered his gun. His eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. I'm sorry, Ethan. I never wanted this for you. Ethan's voice was tight. Why didn't you tell me? John sighed. I tried to protect you, but I made mistakes. I thought by keeping my distance, I could keep you safe. Laura, standing beside Ethan, placed a hand on his shoulder. Ethan, we need to go. The police will be here soon. Ethan looked at his father. You need to come with us. John shook his head. I can't. I have to finish what I started. The family man still has connections. I need to dismantle what's left. Ethan's eyes filled with pain. I can't lose you again. John gave a small, sad smile. You won't. But I need you to take care of your mother. And Laura. Ethan clenched his jaw, knowing there was no changing his father's mind. Promise me you'll stay safe. John nodded. I'll do my best. As they left the warehouse, Ethan and Laura moved quickly through the shadows. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Ethan's thoughts were a whirlwind. His father was alive, but still trapped in the same dangerous world. What now? Laura asked, her voice soft. Ethan took a deep breath, the weight of the night settling on his shoulders. We clear my mother's name, and we make sure this ends for good. They reached the car, and Ethan pulled out the files they had taken. This is everything we need. Jake's operation, the money laundering, it's all here. Laura's eyes brightened. We can prove your mother's innocence. Ethan nodded. And we will. The next morning, Ethan stood outside the police station, a folder full of evidence in his hand. Laura was beside him, her expression hopeful. Are you ready? Ethan nodded. It's time to end this. Inside, he presented the evidence to the detectives. With the information they had gathered, they not only cleared Elena's name, but also exposed the crime ring's operations. Jake's associates were arrested, and the mall's corrupt staff were brought to justice. A week later, Ethan visited his mother at her apartment. Elena's eyes filled with relief when she saw him. Is it really over? Ethan smiled, pulling her into a hug. It's over, Mom. You're safe. As they sat down for tea, Elena asked about his father. Did you find out the truth? Ethan hesitated, then nodded. I did, and he was trying to protect us. But he's still out there, doing what he can to make things right. Elena's eyes softened. He always did what he thought was best. Ethan nodded, feeling a sense of closure. And now, I need to do the same. In the weeks that followed, Ethan and Laura worked together, helping those caught in the web of the crime ring start fresh. Laura finally escaped her past, free from Jake's control, and Ethan found a renewed sense of purpose. Though the scars of his father's choices remained, Ethan knew he had taken the right path. He had faced the shadows of his past, uncovered the truth, and protected those he loved. And as he looked toward the future, he knew he was ready for whatever came next.